Good day once again to everybody. We are going to wait for 2 more minutes and then we are going to start because some other participants are going to join for the welcoming remarks. So we are going to start in about 2 minutes. I can see Miss Kateryna Borisovna, Uliana, Christina Kit, Miss Ilona. So I suggest that we can start. And we hope that other participants are going to join us soon. Greetings to everybody. Welcome to today's meeting that we are going to start the online international conference, the gender dimension of the war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. So we would like to present the results of the research of the gender dimension of war conducted by the JurFem Analytical Center with the support of the USAID Justice for All activity. And we are going to tell you about the gender aspect of the war crimes, what it is, why it is important to identify it, and then we are going to discuss the recommendations of the protection of survivors of the war crimes and bringing perpetrators to responsibility. I would like to say that this activity has been possible with the support of the American people through the USAID within the Justice for All activity. And the results of the conference constitute the conclusions and opinions of the research team and do not necessarily reflect the views of the United States Agency for International Development or the United States government. We are also expecting international and national experts during our meeting, representatives of the Judiciary, Office of the Prosecutor General, lawyers community, of the national legal schools and schools of law and other experts during today's meeting. So I suggest to start. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Kateryna Levchenko, Government Commissioner for the Gender Policy, for the welcoming remarks and to present the gender aspects of war crimes, and also she will make some welcoming remarks. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Kateryna. Greetings, dear colleagues. I hope you can hear me well. Good. Greetings, first of all, to the Analytical Center JurFem and the Women Lawyers Association of Ukraine. I thank you for conducting this important research, which allows a wide circle of readers. It allows the wide audience not only to have a deep dive into the theoretical questions of law, international humanitarian law, national criminal law, but also readers can find out about practical aspects of helping to the survivors of the war crimes, which have been committed by the Russian army on the territory of Ukraine. And also it covers the questions of bringing perpetrators to responsibility for those crimes. Every phenomena, including antisocial phenomena, including war crimes and the war and the crimes of genocide, always have a gender dimension. And the war has a gender dimension as well as the violence that is committed by the Russian military. It also has a gender aspect and dimension. And when we are looking at the situation, when we look at the state of affairs through this gender lens, as we say, we have the opportunity to better understand these phenomena and to have a better response. We can provide for the needs, not for the average statistical person, but we can adapt our help to specific people, boys and girls, to the specific groups of the population. And when we say that war crimes have a gender aspect, we understand that they have different impact on women and men. We understand that different crimes can be committed. Some of those crimes some types of the crimes can be committed mostly against women. Other types of crimes can be committed mostly against men. And these specific types of crimes needs a relevant response. As for the war crimes with a gender aspect, we can speak about the sexual violence which is committed by the Russian military. But it would be a mistake to say that the gender violence during the war only impacts girls and women. Taking into account the experience of other countries and the existing current practice of the National Police, the Security Service of Ukraine, the Office of the Prosecutor General, civil society organizations like Lastrada Ukraine, hotlines, or social services of Ukraine, they show that there is a big share of men among the survivors as well. So when we are talking about services, when we talk about provision of help to the survivors, we always need to take the gender aspect into account. But not only conflict-related sexual violence has a gender aspect. We also see the forced separation of married couples, illegal adoption of children, lack of provision of the necessary medical assistance to pregnant women and to those women who are expecting children. So the collective of authors are covering a wide range of issues, wide range of aspects related to the gender aspect of the war. This is one of the first researches of the kind that we are discussing, that we are reading, and this is a big advantage of this work. It is very timely and relevant. It is informed by the materials of the first months of the full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine. And of course, as the first work, it needs further review and continuation of work, because situation is constantly developing. There are certain trends that we can see. Unfortunately, we can see the change in the essence of different war crimes committed by the Russians. And all of this has to be demonstrated and researched on the theoretical level as well. It is important that this research has recommendations, and those recommendations are covering different types of activities. It is necessary that those recommendations should be targeted so that we understand the target audience. And of course, the legal community would be interested in the necessary changes in the legislation and in the necessity of taking into account gender aspects in gender mainstreaming when we develop laws and regulations, to make all those laws and regulations gender sensitive. And this research shows that unfortunately that some of the documents, like procedures for determining the damages done by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, are not gender sensitive. The draft joint order of the State Property Fund and the Ministry of Economy regarding the methodology of calculation of damages is also not gender sensitive. I would like us not only to make statements about the facts, but also we need certain suggestions on how we can make those documents gender sensitive. I listed only 2 documents. The research has a lot more, a bigger list, but I don't want to delay the time of the listeners. So I would like to ask you in the future to make some practical specific steps as a result of our today's discussions, and we are going to welcome new ideas about how we can use gender mainstreaming, gender approaches in our work. This is important not only today, but this is important for the recovery of Ukraine, because the principle of gender equality and inclusion is one of the 7 pillars on which the recovery has to take place, according to the decisions made in the previous year on the Ukrainian Recovery Conference, which took place in Lugano. So we still have a lot of things to work on. And the last point, yesterday I mentioned this during our information event when we were presenting the research of the gender dimension of war to the wide public. And I repeat this quite often, and I would like to repeat this today once again, that the conclusions in the research, they are about the necessity to update the international standards. I mean, the Geneva standards, if we are talking about violation of rights to healthcare services, but also we need to update other international documents regarding participation of women in the recovery, in the post-conflict recovery, and participation of women in the protection of their country. Of course, these documents really need to be updated right now. And when we are processing this bitter experience, Ukrainians are ready to present their point of view on the current existing international documents in this area. And I think that this is going to be a very important contribution of the Ukrainian society and Ukrainian legal community into the improvement of the international law. So please set for yourself some new high tasks and objectives. As an organization, you are capable to do this. You have the support from the international community, from the government, and in my person as a government commissioner on gender policy, other government agencies and officials are supporting you, and your work will help to bring Russia to responsibility in the nearer times, and to restore the justice, to restore the rights of our citizens who have suffered from the hands of the Russian military. Thank you. Thank you, Kateryna Borisovna. Thank you for your relevant recommendations and the necessity to continue your work on recommendations and to implementing the recommendations is one of the tasks of today's and tomorrow's meetings, because we believe that participation of the experts in the discussion will allow us to develop new suggestions in order to ensure gender mainstreaming by different agencies who are involved in bringing perpetrators to responsibility. And this activity, this research, that would not be possible without the support of our partner organizations. So I have the honor to invite Ms. Uliana Poshevich from the USAID and we are from the USAID, and we would like to ask her for the welcoming remarks. Thank you, Kateryna Borisovna, for your remarks, for your welcoming speech, and for the support of this research. Thank you. On behalf of the USAID activity Justice for All, I would like to thank to everybody for engaging in today's discussion of the research conducted by JurFem on gender and legal analysis of violation of human rights and war crimes committed by the Russian military in Ukraine during the full-scale invasion, and discussion of the impact of those violations and crimes on boys and girls, men and women. And our program, our activity, was happy to support this research because, as Ms. Kateryna Borisovna has mentioned, This is the first, probably the first comprehensive research of the gender aspects of war. And of course, its conclusions would be useful for the prosecutors, lawyers, advocates, judges, and profile civil society organizations, specialized non-government organizations who work with the survivors. The research has materials on different topics. If you have read it, you know the topics. Ms. Kateryna has already outlined some of the topics indicated or included in the research. These are typical violations by the customs of war and laws of war. This is about deportation of the Ukrainian civilian population, including Ukrainian children. This is a question of destroying civilian buildings on the territory of the country, the question of reparations. And as has been mentioned today, this research pays a lot of attention to the questions of conflict-related sexual violence. In this context, I would like to add that this material, there is a very interesting material prepared by Marta Havryshko. It is entitled Sexual Crimes of Russia in the War Against Ukraine, as a history which is repeating. So why is this interesting? In this material, I have found some of the answers to the questions that I had in the first months of war, when the terrible facts of atrocities of Russians against Ukrainians have been revealed, including sexual violence against women, men, children, elderly people, regarding our prisoners of war, which was demonstrated to the entire world, because you understand that these crimes have been committed by them in the first weeks of the war. So they didn't become this way during the war. They already had these atrocities. They already were so cruel when they were entering Ukraine. So we have an historic analysis, and we have some examples of the history of the 20th century. There are examples of the crimes of war crimes committed by the Russian military against civilians on the territory of Ukraine. So we can see the historical roots and the cultural background in the Russian society. This is misogyny and sexism and propaganda to dehumanize Ukrainians. And this is multiplied by the ethnical stereotypes and military and political goals. And all of this has led to the atrocious crime, terrible crimes that we can see today. I would like to say that we are happy that this research has drawn attention from the Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine, and we can see Mr. Kostyan, the Prosecutor General, has made an introduction into the research, and they always underline that the prosecutors are trying to use as much as possible the gender aspects when they work with cases of war crimes, including cases of sexual violence, because the survivors and witnesses are vulnerable people in this category of crimes, and we need to have sensitive communication and take into account the gender aspects. And we hope that all the other partners in the judiciary, in the advocacy community, in the human rights community and civil society organizations will take into account the research conclusions. And our program, our activity, USAID, Justice for All, we are providing active support to all the important initiatives and efforts aimed to bringing war criminals to responsibility and ensuring the justice and ensuring access to justice for the survivors. We work with the National School of Judges of Ukraine. We help to provide training for judges who are already considering or will be considering cases of war crimes, because we know that the largest number of this colossal figure of criminal proceedings that have been registered under the Article 438 violation of the customs of war will be considered by the national judiciary system of Ukraine, and the international mechanisms are supplementary. We are supporting the national judiciary system, the national law enforcement, to restore the work of the courts in order to ensure access to justice for people. We are procuring relevant equipment and office equipment which was looted by the occupiers. We also support legal aid, charge-free legal aid, and we support local initiatives and organizations that work with the vulnerable categories of people and that provide psychological, legal, and other types of help to the survivors. I would like to thank JurFem once again. I would like to thank to all of the authors of the report and research, and thanks to the office, to the Prosecutor General and Ms. Kateryna Levchenko, Government Commissioner, for supporting this initiative in conducting this research. Thanks for the attention, and I wish everybody successful discussions. Thank you, Ms. Uliana. Thank you for supporting us in these initiatives, and evidently the support of international experts and the view of international experts is very important. I'm pleased to say that international universities, the leading European universities, also participated in the support and partnership in this event. And right now we have the opportunity to give the floor for welcoming remarks to researchers. And I would like to start with inviting Ms. Ilona Mikhailovich, the Doctor of Law, Associate Professor of the Faculty of Law of the Vilnius University, which is a partner in this event.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me and everything is okay. Okay, thank you. Dear colleagues, dear organizers and participants of the conference, it's my pleasure to be here with you today to participate in the opening of the international conference, Gender Dimension of the Russian War Against Ukraine. In light of the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Law Faculty of Vilnius University would like to show its support. And one of the main initiatives was the establishment of the Center of Ukrainian Law at the Faculty of Law of Vilnius University. This Center of Ukrainian Law brings together scientists and legal practitioners from Ukraine, Lithuania, and other countries to carry out cooperation in various forms aimed at strengthening the Ukrainian legal community's relations with lawyers, academics, and practitioners from other countries. In cooperation with Ukrainian researchers, the Center of Ukrainian Law offers courses for Ukrainian students continuing their studies at Vilnius University. Today, we are addressing a key question for the conference, Gender Dimension of the Russian War Against Ukraine. And it is important to emphasize that both international documents and scientific research have recognized that war has multiple effects on gender equality and gender roles. Moreover, sexual violence becomes a war strategy. In this context, the Law Faculty of Vilnius University is a partner of the informational international campaign Rape is a War Crime, which is a private initiative by several international lawyers and experts of communication from Lithuania and abroad. Our Rape is a War Crime campaign is carried out in cooperation with many institutional partners. The Rape is a War Crime campaign is an open access resource hub for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Its aim is to train lawyers on how to meet the needs of survivors. We work to raise the awareness of gender-based violence in conflict zones, help the survivors of sexual violence, and enhance accountability for war crimes. Today, the Analytical Center of the Ukrainian Women Lawyers Association JurFem will present the research, Gender Dimension of War. It is important that based on the study, Recommendations will be developed regarding the protection of war crime survivors and the prosecution of perpetrators. I believe that our institutional cooperation can help restore the future. I wish you successful discussions at today's conference. Thank you.
Дякую, щиро вам дякую за
Sincere thanks for your participation today, and in general for supporting Ukraine, for supporting Ukrainian men and women in these times. And it is very important for the academic community of the leading international universities. It is very important for them to be able to participate in the discussions and have their opinions and recommendations heard, because it is very important for Ukraine to have this expert support in terms of identifying gender aspects of war and working with the survivors. It is very important. And I would also like to invite Ms. Kateryna Uglishova from the Masaryk University, Department of International and European Law, Assistant Professor. Please, the floor is yours for the welcoming remarks.
Good morning, everyone, distinguished speakers and participants. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this very important event. I wish to also join Vilnius University in just briefly mentioning some activities on the part of the Czech Republic Masaryk University. Masaryk University is based in Brno. And when the aggression against Ukraine started almost a year ago, Masaryk University actually responded to the situation by providing assistance to Ukrainian students and employees, and also to their families through various activities such as Muni Helps, which is a Masaryk University Helps Volunteer Center, and also other means. And in this respect, there was a fundraising campaign also launched for Ukrainian students and academics fleeing the war, and there were always almost 1,000 donors, which contributed to amount 1.1 million Czech crowns. We also created a special scholarship fund for Ukrainians and launched a special admission program, and also opened Czech courses for Ukrainian students. Speaking of which, I teach international public law, so there were Czech and also courses in English, and I had also a chance to work with some Ukrainian students, very smart ones, and Masaryk University also established a staff support program to hire academics and researchers, and also offered all incoming Ukrainians accommodation, psychological counseling, and interpretation services. So I don't want to just name the numbers, but just to give an idea that I believe the support was wide. We have over 1,000 volunteers across the university. We established also a legal aid at the law faculty, not only for Ukrainian students and academics, but anyone who came actually and needed the help. In addition to financial aid, there were also scholarships granted, and Masaryk University also accepted over 1,000 applications to study in so-called extraordinary admission procedure, and almost 500 students already accepted to study in this context. There were also over 100 concluded job contracts when it comes to employment, and we continue several other activities. So in other words, our minds are with Ukraine, and some of your great minds are currently also based in Brno, be students and also academics. And as regards the topic of the conference, I'm happy to join later on during a panel, but I consider this extremely important topic. I previously had a chance to work at the War Crimes Chamber in the state court in Bosnia and Herzegovina after the conflict there, and at the ICTY, at the Office of the President. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that I think, as some of the distinguished speakers before said, Ms. Kateryna Levchenko, that it will be very important and I assume challenging for Ukraine and all involved actors to actually investigate and prosecute sexual and gender-based crimes, as there can be and surely will be also some challenges relating to the international law and how international law was or is incorporated into domestic law, because surely there can be challenges before domestic as opposed to international tribunals when prosecuting these crimes. So I look forward to listen and to hear from more speakers, and I think I can pause now at this point. Thank you very much once again for invitation, and I look forward to hear other panelists and views.
Щиро дякую, пані Катержино, і запрошую до слова.
Sincere thanks, Ms. Katarzyna. I would like to invite Ms. Christina Kit, the head of the Women's Lawyers Association, JurFem. Greetings, dear colleagues. Greetings, dear partners. I'm very grateful to the USAID program, Justice for All, to the USAID activity, which helped us to prepare this analytical research and this analytical report. Also, I would like to thank to our authors who agreed to join our initiative in order to review the war crime, the gender violence, gender crimes committed by the Russian Federation, using the gender aspect and the gender lens. As Ms. Levchenko has mentioned, this is very important and this is very valuable, because every crime committed by the Russian Federation on the territory of Ukraine, it has gender component and it has a different impact on boys and girls, men and women who live in Ukraine. In this analytical report, you will be able to see different types of war crimes, not only conflict-related sexual violence, and also it will help you to analyze the most So we were able to analyze the most widespread war crimes thanks to the participation of our experts who joined the research, and every expert has their own field of competence of war crimes. Of course, we as a Women Lawyers Association, we are paying most of our attention to the conflict-related sexual violence. But because of the involvement of a wide circle of aspects, we were able to analyze other types of war crimes. Besides that, I would like to thank to our partners from the government, to the Government Commissioner on Gender Policy, and thanks to the Office of the Prosecutor General, who are actively involved in our work. And they understand that we need to take into account the gender component in our work, in the development of legislation and in the investigations. So the gender aspect in the investigations and gender aspect in the government policy is a standard of quality that will allow us to ensure the high quality response. And this is one of the prerequisites from the government and from the Office of the Prosecutor General for successful work in the future. So this research, the materials included in this material are an important addition to the training programs that are being developed for investigation of war crimes and response to war crimes, crimes against humanity and the genocide committed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. That's why we encourage everybody, including the academic community, to use these materials in your own training curricula, in your schools and universities, in the law universities. Also, we encourage our international partners from the law universities to use the materials. With the support of the USAID program Justice for All, we were able to translate these materials, this research into English language. It is important that these materials are used not only by lawyers of Ukraine, but this unfortunate and bitter experience can serve to the international community as well. It will help them analyze and to see whether our international mechanisms are really efficient to respond to the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity which are committed in Ukraine. Please use our materials, please share them. And today and tomorrow we are going to have 2 days of discussions around every publication. So please use this opportunity to ask questions in the comments, to provide your comments and feedback in the discussion. Because as you can see, today we have a format of the webinar because we have a lot of participants. So in order to have a more efficient communication, we have created a webinar format. Unfortunately, we can't see everybody, but we can read your comments, and we will be happy to respond to your comments and answer to your questions. I'm inviting everybody to the discussion to share your opinions. Please give us your feedback and recommendations, because as Ms. Kateryna has mentioned, it is evident that this collection of analytical materials is the first analytical report prepared from the beginning of the full-scale invasion into Ukraine. So mostly the data in the materials are covering the statistics and situation from the previous year, from 2022. But the situation is changing dynamically, and the Ukrainian institutions and civil society organizations have developed a lot of new ways of work. We have different ways to responding to the situation in Ukraine. So please provide your comments, recommendations, and suggestions that we can include in the further revisions of these materials, so that would help us to continue our analytical work using the new data. I wish everybody fruitful discussion and efficient work, because these questions are very practical and they touch upon every person who lives in Ukraine. Thank you, Kateryna. Before proceeding to the presentation of the research, I would like to remind our today's agenda for today and tomorrow. So today we are going to have several panel discussions. So the topics that we are going to discuss: the nature of war crime, the gender aspects of the crimes committed by the military of the Russian Federation and other military units on the territory of Ukraine. Another today's topic will be sexual violence during the conflict. And also I hope that we are going to have some time for discussion of these 2 wide topics. As for tomorrow, we are going to discuss forced deportation and abduction of Ukrainian people, including children, and possibility of achieving justice. And also we will have the question of cross-cutting question of reparations that we are going to discuss today and tomorrow. I'm inviting everybody to actively participate in the discussion, to ask questions, but at first I would like to tell you a few words about the research itself. You had the opportunity to review it on our website. It has been published already, and we are going to send it to all the registered participants. So what it is about and who participated in the research. As I have mentioned, the gender dimensions of war research was prepared by the JurFem Analytical Center with the support of the USAID Justice for All activity. The analytical team and experts who work with different war crimes, it is an honor to name them. This is Kateryna Busol, Marta Gawryszko, Володимир Гончаров, Krystyna Dubać, Marina Żoltucha, Ivan Karpevin, Artem Krykun-Trusz, Gajkena Rychenyan, Irina Senyuta, and me, Kateryna Shunevych. I was one of the co-authors of this research. Also, it is important that support of the topics that we were analyzing, that we were trying to look at through the gender lens, our work was supported by the Office of the Prosecutor General. The Prosecutor General's office also participated in the introduction, and they say the gender aspect in the investigations has to be in the focus, not only for the academic community, but to all people who work on these violations. So the topics are the typical violations of the rules and customs of war, committed by the Russian Federation and their types and forms. We are going to talk about the conflict-related sexual violence. We were going to talk about abductions and forceful deportation from the occupied territory. Another important aspect is deportation of children to the territory of the aggressor country, also including the arrest warrant for Putin, and why this started with this particular violation of human rights. So it will be necessary for us to discuss this as well. Also, we are going to discuss the reparation and redressal and why the financial redressal should not be the only form of reparation. Our experts are going to participate in this discussion as well. Violation of the right to medical assistance and why the medical care which is necessary for Ukrainian citizens, why it has been violated, taking into account the military aggression. This is also one of the questions that we are going to discuss. Another important block are the prospects and possibilities to bringing perpetrators to responsibility, those who are violating human rights. So who is going to do this? What courts are going to consider these cases? We are going to discuss this today and tomorrow. I would like to remind you that the method that we were trying to use during the research, we were trying to use the method of gender and legal analysis. So it included the analysis of the current legislation and national legislation and international law and working with actual data. So the number of registered crimes, cases highlighted in the mass media regarding violation of human rights. I would like to remind you that, especially from the start of the full-scale invasion, this information was often insufficient. It was appearing in the mass media and it triggered different reactions from the legal community and from the citizens of Ukraine, from the society. It is important to analyze this as well. You will be able to find the links in our work. Also, in the gender analysis, we were using the two main aspects, two main points indicated in our research. The first principle is that the war crimes are committed against men and women, but, for example, as against men and women or elderly people or children, separate crimes have more influence or have a bigger impact. Separate crimes against separate types of population because of the cultural customs and norms. So our aim was to show, we wanted to show that it has impact on everybody, but in different ways. Different war crimes are impacting lives of people in different ways. And we were trying to find out about the relevant and necessary forms of response to the violation of human rights. Also, we have prepared a number of recommendations, and I would like to invite Ms. Kateryna Kit, the head of the Women's Lawyers Ukraine JurFem, to present some of the findings. Thank you, Kateryna, because I will be very brief. You will be able to read the recommendations in the work, in the research. I'm going to put them into groups. First of all, we have recommendations for the necessity to develop and implement the legislation to register the status of the survivors of war and to register and for payment of the reparations to the survivors of the war crimes in Ukraine. In fact, this process is gaining momentum in Ukraine, and the law enforcement and civil society organizations are actively working on those mechanisms. But I would like to point attention to the fact that in the development of any mechanisms about payment of reparations or registering the status of survivors of war crimes, it is necessary to take the gender aspect and gender component into account so that this legislation, primary or secondary legislation, would cover the needs of every survivor from the war crimes. Another block of recommendations developed by the authors of the report are the recommendations about development and implementation of programs of healthcare, special, psychological, economic support for the survivors of the war crimes. Because according to the reports of the international organizations, when we analyze them, the reports of the organizations who document the war crimes in Ukraine, as we can see, the urgent needs of the survivors are the needs for safety, medical help, mental support, economic support, rehabilitation, and after that, they need also legal support and investigation of crimes and bringing perpetrators to responsibility. So it is necessary to ensure the basic needs of the survivors of the war so that later the survivors of the war crimes would be able to provide testimony about their experience and communicate with the law enforcement system, the legal system, and legal community of Ukraine and the judiciary. Another important point that we have been discussing for a long time, and we mention it every time, and I would like to mention it once again, is when implementing any programs or during investigation of war crimes, it is necessary to ensure the principle of confidentiality, of privacy, and we need to avoid re-traumatization of survivors of the war crimes. We have to bear those points in mind all the time. We don't need to forget about those principles, and we need to think how we can work in a better way to restore the rights of the survivors, taking into account the two principles of confidentiality and prevention of re-traumatization of the survivors of war crimes. These are the main components. Also, important attention was given to the procedures of investigating war crimes in the report, and also to the procedures of expert research, judiciary and medical expertise, and because according to the legislation of Ukraine, we have a limited list of medical experts, because only government institutions are authorized to conduct expert research, and sometimes this can be a challenge for justice when we have a wide range of crimes, but we have a limited circle of experts. So my colleague Kateryna Shunevych is going to talk about this in more details, because this is a part of her expert research. And also we have a topic of reparation to the survivors from war crimes. I have already mentioned this. And we need to bear in mind that we mean not only the material compensation of the damages. This is also about services to the survivors of war crimes, and it's also very valuable to bear in mind that these interventions should not be short-term, like payments or services, because depending on the impact and consequences of every war crime, we need to understand how long we need to support a person who has suffered. Sometimes this support will be needed for the entire life, because the consequences of some crimes like sexual violence during the conflict can have an impact for the entire life of a survivor. And support from the government is very valuable, and this has to be indicated in the future mechanisms that we are going to develop to ensure the reparation and help to the survivors of war crimes. So what is the aim of all this work? Why do we work? We need to bear this in mind. One of the forms of reparations is a guarantee that the crime will not be repeated. And to ensure this guarantee of non-repetition of the crime, so in order to do this, we need to bring perpetrators to account, and also we need to build an efficient system of response in Ukraine and an efficient system of support to the survivors. We are going to discuss every separate recommendation and conclusion, and maybe during the discussion we will be able to develop some new recommendations that we will be able to include into the new revision of this work, of this report. If you have any questions or suggestions to the research, you can send your opinions and suggestions to our email. We are going to quickly respond to them. And if you have any questions during the discussion, please raise your hands or please write your comments into the chat. Right now, I suggest that we move on to the first discussion, the first topic of our conversation. These are the crimes committed by the Russian Federation on the territory of Ukraine, the history that is repeating. So we have right now the speakers are joining, and I would like to invite Ms. Manta Gavryshko, Yevhen Kropivin, Irina Senyuta, and Ms. Katarzyna Ugleshova. While the speakers are joining, I would like to mention that during this panel, we are going to discuss typical violations or the systemic violations and crimes. So what is the essence of those crimes? What are the elements of crimes? And did we have this experience during the previous wars? I would like to start with Ms. Marta Gavryshko, PhD in History, Department of Contemporary History of Kripikevich Institute, and the researcher of the juris program at the University of Basel. So, Marta, I would like to invite you to speak. Good morning, Kateryna. Thank you for the introduction. I would like to show my presentation. Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to sincerely thank you for the possibility to participate in the discussion and for the possibility to participate in the project. For me, this is a big honor as a researcher of conflict-related sexual violence on the territory of Ukraine. You know, I was very shocked by the crimes committed by the Russian army. And many of those quickly reminded me the memoirs, the memories, the documents that I was reading about the previous wars. Women that I was talking to were participants of the Ukrainian underground movement for the independence of Ukraine against the Soviet Union and against the Soviet power. They were telling me a lot how they were humiliated when they were held prisoners during the military operations and what the language was during the gender violence. They have these memories until now. The women that I was talking to during the years 16 to 18, they were more than 90 years old, but they still remembered those perpetrators. Mostly, these were the officers of the Red Army, soldiers of the Red Army, officers of the security service of the Soviet Union. A lot of them were Russian men who came to the territory of Ukraine to pacify its citizens. Right now, I would like to show you some traits of this continuum of violence that we can witness from the Russian soldiers on the territory of Ukraine. We have all heard about the sexual violence of the Russian army on the territory of Germany in 1945. We have researches of Anthony Beaver and others that only in Berlin, more than 100,000 girls and women were raped, and 10,000 of those died due to the venereal diseases as a result of injuries or due to suicides. From the Russian memorial documents and from the reports of the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, we know about the crimes of Russian army in Chechnya. We have testimonies of girls and parents, but we know that nobody was brought to responsibility. Only Budanov, the Russian officer, who, as a result of his crime, the accusations were lifted in the end. We know about the crimes of the Russian army in Georgia, Syria, and other territories. So this is a chain of crimes that were not paid for. And also they were committing crimes during the other wars, like the First World War. We have memories from the Ukrainian political activists like Ivan Kudrovets, who has testimony about the crimes of the Russian army at the territory of Ivano-Frankivsk region in 1917s. As you can see, looting and well, they were raping women and girls and all women. The Russian soldiers were doing this for 5 days, and the head of the city was present there in Kalush. The mayor did nothing to stop these crimes of the Russian soldiers during the First World War. Also, the territory of the Western Ukraine, Galician territory, was occupied by the Russian army from August 1914 until the August of 1919. And due to dehumanization of Ukrainian people who were living in the Western Ukraine at that time, and they were the citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were perceived as enemies. And there were the waves of pogroms by Russian soldiers in Sokal, Lviv, Buchach, and other towns against Ukrainians and Jews. So we have different memories of rape and terror when Jewish girls and women were raped and eyes were taken out of injured of men. So, for example, we see the examples when men are trying to protect their women, their daughters and wives, but they are falling victims of the Russian crimes. The pogroms, the violence of the Russian army and the White Army. These are different Russian Cossack units and also partially Red Army committed a lot of crimes during the revolution and during the Civil War. And we can see the memories of the Red Army soldiers like Isaac Babel, who was also repressed for expressing the truth. He was also saying that these girls and women were struggling to move because they were raped by the Russian soldiers and they had a lot of sexually transmitted diseases. The rape of the committed by the Russian army during the Second World War were committed in Hungary and other countries. In Hungary, we have the research of Andrea Peto and other researchers who say that there were hundreds of thousands raped women. And also Leonid Bernstein, the lieutenant of the Red Army, who used to be the officer of the underground unit of the Soviet underground resistance unit. He remembers how his soldiers were looting the local population and raping local women. I suggest that everybody should see this film, this Israeli film, which is based on the memories of Leonid Bernstein. We know that during the so-called liberation in 1943-1944 from the Nazi people, there were a lot of women, German women who were hiding in ghettos, were raped by the Russian army. For example, Hanna Meisel remembers that in camp Maikivka of Vinnytsia region, which was liberated by the Russian army, women were afraid to be raped. She was a young girl and she survived an attempt to be raped committed by the Russian army soldier. It is also important to remember that for Ukraine, the war did not finish by signing a peaceful agreement of the capitulation of Germany and Japan. Ukraine also survived another war after the war, and the Ukrainian nationalist underground movement, resistant movement for restoration of the Ukrainian state, it continued for more than 10 years after the Second World War. As a result, about 153,000 participants of the resistance were killed and arrested. Tens of thousands suffered. When I was talking to the local students about Ukrainian nationalist underground movement, so 153,000 is almost like a population of the city of Basel. So can you imagine if a population of the town could be killed for their ideas, for their beliefs? We had thousands of women who participated in the underground movement. They were combatants. They were ensuring their liaison. They were medical nurses, and a lot of them have been raped during the military operations of the Russian army. The survivors were not only those women who participated in the underground resistance movement, but also the civilians also suffered, because for the Soviet government, this was a method of war against the resistance movement. It was a signal, it was a message: don't support the resistance. The message was, because they will not be able to protect you. And a lot of daughters, a lot of sisters, a lot of women were raped. So here you can see different testimonies from the participants of this resistance movement about how these rapes were happening, who were suffering from them. As we can see, often these were young women and girls who didn't have anything to do with the Ukrainian resistance movement. The most astonishing stories are those personal human stories that I heard, including from the sister of my grandmother, who survived sexual violence in the Lviv prison because she was participating in the Ukrainian Red Cross. It was the medical service of the Ukrainian resistance army. And Maria was arrested in 1949. She was imprisoned into the prison in Lviv. So she was giving testimony of people as the investigators were undressing her and humiliating her, and they were standing and laughing at her. And here we can see the repetition of this discourse, the revitalization that of those women, not only in the Halachina region, who can have memories about the resistance movement, but also women in Kherson region and other locations. They are accusing the Russian army today. So this label is still continuing in the discourse of dehumanization. So women who are speaking against the Russian invasion, they are labeled as banderas by the Russian propaganda. So the anti-Ukrainian discourse of the Russian Federation still continues, and the chain of violence was happening because very few Russian soldiers were brought to responsibility, mostly due to political reasons, because for the Russian power, the Russian government, for the Moscow leadership, every ways of work were okay, including the sexual violence. And this Mr. Burbukin, the security officer who violated the 18-year-old Maria in the prison, was only one of the few who were condemned, who were brought to responsibility for the atrocities of the Russian army during the investigations, during the interrogations against women. And this is a very good example of how the lack of punishment is, how impunity brings to the lawlessness of the military, and how this violence is encouraged by the impunity. And what lessons we have to make out of this to bring to responsibility the Russian criminals in Ukraine, the Russian perpetrators, to break this chain of impunity. And I believe that we have all the necessary resources, we have the will, we have the experts that we can engage in order to finally break this chain of impunity of the Russian violence on different territories. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Marta. In fact, it is very difficult to start with this topic, but this used to happen in the history, and we have this today. And when we understand the systematic nature and the repetition of this, also we have a question of how we can ensure that this is never going to happen again. In order to do this, it is necessary to look into the history. Thank you to this overview, and let us look at the current situation after the start of the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation. So I'm inviting Mr. Ivan Karpevin, expert at Just Group, expert at the Center of Policy and Legal Reform. I'm inviting you to speak, and maybe we can get back to these issues during the discussion. Thank you, Kateryna, for this opportunity to speak. Greetings to all the participants and listeners. I'm going to talk about the current state of affairs. I will make a sort of introduction, and I'm going to describe the typical patterns of behavior. So, the patterns of phenomena and the patterns of international crime, not only war crimes committed by the Russian army, and also other colleagues are going to cover some other specific aspects. As for the gender and legal perspective, I would like to mention that it is important to look into the international crimes committed in this war from different angles. I believe that we have a sufficient number of initiatives and activists who register these crimes in different forms for different aims, but they allow us to have empirical data to make conclusions about the crimes that are committed. And I believe that every Ukrainian who is located in Ukraine or outside Ukraine, they can clearly see what the crimes are, who is committing those crimes, and who are the perpetrators. But as for the analytical research and generalizations by using the correct legal qualifications, this is what we were missing. And the unique role of the gender legal approach is to see the typical patterns of behavior and to analyze certain gender-based activities. As it has been already mentioned, rightfully mentioned, and I agree that we have to bear in mind that we started working on this material, on this research in the previous year. So right now it is missing some of the trends, and I would like to add some things. So after the year of practice in the criminal justice, of criminal investigations, pre-trial investigations of war crimes, of course, we are talking about the war crimes as serious violations of international humanitarian law and violations of international humanitarian law. For example, the disproportional use of power, the Hague law, the unproportional use of weapons, the use of unnecessary weapons that impacts the civilian population and against the military. And also we have a lot of violations of Geneva Convention, which protects the civilian population and which forbids deportation and separation of families. It is forbidding to set up the filtration camps where people are humiliated, tortured, and undergoing famine. But also we can speak about a wider picture. During this year, we understand that we can speak not only about war crimes, but we can say that those crimes are systematic, they are repetitive, and these patterns of behavior, they show us that we can speak about crimes against humanity, and our partners, the United States of America, they are giving the certain signals, including the statement of Mr. Anthony Blinken from the Department of State. They state that they are looking into those crimes in Ukraine as crimes against humanity. And the United States has joined the joint investigative group. And in the previous year, they have made changes into their legislation. They have introduced the universal jurisdiction in the states, which they didn't have before. And I believe that this legal discussion about qualification of crimes against humanity, it is gaining momentum. As for the genocide, after the arrest warrant for Putin, it is clear that the cases of mass systematic deportation of children, it is also associated with the separation of families. So these crimes have to be investigated separately. Of course, the international judiciary are not talking about genocide. This is mostly discussed by the Ukrainian national community, but the discussion is gaining momentum. I would like to tell about this because the gender crimes that we are going to discuss today, especially in the part of deportation, which is also a part of genocide, because they are trying to wipe out the identity, the national identity of Ukrainians, and this is a crime of genocide according to the national attribute against the national group of people. So we can describe this as a war crime, as a crime against humanity, as a crime of genocide, and this is a dynamic process. The data that we used to have the year before and what we have now, this data is really different because right now we are rethinking and we are trying to provide the legal qualification of those crimes. I would like to add a few words about the redressals and reparations. Our colleagues are going to discuss them in more details, but this demand for justice in the society that we have, it has different views on the, so to say, we have different views on the topic of vulnerability of the survivors. Judging from the sentiment of the society and activities of the law enforcement agencies, I can see that unlike the crimes, the general crimes against all Ukrainians, for example, the bombing, the indiscreet bombing of the civilian infrastructure that we suffered from during the winter, they are just taken for granted as an inseparable element of war, as people see it as a cruel intention of the enemy, and nobody has doubts about that. But we have other crimes against women and children, and the arrest warrant for Putin and the discussion around this warrant. I believe that society is paying a lot more attention to these types of the crime because those crimes have very dire consequences. Because unlike people whose assets have been damaged, these people can get compensations and restore their assets. And unlike the sexual violence has consequences for the entire life of the survivor, and it cannot be properly redressed. We can create mechanisms for medical rehabilitation, psychological and social help, but once again, this crime is going to have continuous impact on people, and there are threats of re-victimization during the investigation and after it. The risks are very high, so we have to pay special attention. We have to focus on gender aspects, and this is very important for the society, for the law enforcement and people who are trying to restore the justice, and also for the survivors who often don't even understand the scale of the damage inflicted, and they don't always understand the amount of support that they need. So I believe that this report will make a big contribution into the rethinking and re-understanding and analysis of the patterns of behavior, which have also gender aspect, because they have to do with all the Ukrainians as residents of the country who suffered from the military aggression. Thank you, Yevhen. Thank you for these important ideas, even beyond the research. And thank you for participating in this research in general. And right now I can see Miss Irina, Miss Irina Senyuta, a doctor of law, professor, head of the Department of Medical Law at the Danilo Halitsky Lviv National Medical University, chair of the Committee for Medical and Pharmaceutical Law and Bioethics, managing partner of the Medlex law firm. Miss Irina, please, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot. Sincere thanks to the organizers. Thanks to the USAID and JurFem for the opportunity to participate in this research. And thank you for inviting me to make a presentation. I'm sorry, right now I have this possibility to borrow this room and to make my report. I believe that this is a very important research, and I believe that it is going to help ensure efficient protection of human rights in Ukraine. Because those human rights have been violated in different segments because of the times of the war. So my part of research covered the right of women to healthcare services during the war. I was working within the frameworks of the concept of the medical neutrality. This is the concept that I have been working with since 2013. I believe it is going to be included in the laws and regulations. So one of the recommendations about the inefficiency of Geneva Conventions today within our research, because we have cases of violation of the concept of the medical neutrality. So this was our research in the concept of sticking to the principles, including the principle of accessibility and humanism. Also, we indicated that in this case, we have violation of the principles of medical neutrality, and this is a war crime according to the Roma Statute, Article 8, Part 2, Item B. Also, we focused attention on how the government is trying to abide by the national legislation and create the legal framework to ensure the human rights as much as possible. The first aspect that I would like to point out are the issues related to the Constitution. Of course, the Article 49 of the Constitution of Ukraine had to be limited, but according to the Article 64 of the Constitution, the Article 49 can be limited during the conditions of war. But when we were looking into the rights that can be limited in the order of the president, which was approved by the law of Ukraine, and according to the article, so the Article 49 of the Constitution has not been limited. So the government, the state respects the life and health of people, and those rights are not limited. So it shows the value-oriented and human-oriented position of the government. So the rights to the protection of health, to the healthcare, have not been limited in Ukraine. And all the legislation in Ukraine have to follow these rules. I would like to point out that sometimes the national legislature is doing some mistakes, some bad steps, because besides the important vector indicated in the presidential order, we also have the order of the Ministry of Health, number 374 of the Healthcare Ministry, which limits the constitutional rights of people for planned operations, for planned interventions in healthcare. So if we look at the Constitution, the relevant ministry did not have the rights to limit these rights to healthcare and to intervention. Also, I would like to point your attention to the fact that the concept of the medical neutrality, and this have been mentioned by the WHO and the UNFPA and UNICEF have mentioned that we have a lot of destruction of the healthcare facilities. patients and medical workers are killed in the hospitals. And these actions testify to the blunt violation of the concept of medical neutrality. So this concept is defined as a doctrine, and it says the more we do to protect healthcare workers, the more the healthcare workers need to ensure provision of medical help to the patients. So this concept allows us to observe the balance between medical workers and patients. So every patient has a right to be helped, to get relevant medications, and to have access to relevant healthcare professionals. And medical workers need to have possibilities to provide this support. And this balance has to be supported by all the countries. And these accents have been made in the Geneva Convention as well. I would like to say that we have different data. The data of the research is a bit outdated. So right now, the situation has deteriorated. So right now, 106 medical workers have died, and more than hundreds of them at their workplaces. We have more than 1,000 hospitals and facilities that were destroyed or damaged, and a lot of them have been damaged beyond repairs. These are the very big and important and drastic numbers, and they show that our situation is getting worse. The numbers, the data are indicating that the aggressor country is not abiding by the international standards, and the aggressor is trying to create the inhumane conditions both for the patients and for the healthcare workers. When we talk about the principles of accessibility of medical help, we have examples from practice that show us, that are shown to us. And a big example was the birth clinic in Mariupol. The Women's and Birth Children's Hospital was destroyed in Mariupol, and there were a lot of cases when people didn't have access to the medical help, to the medications, when children were born in bomb shelters or in the underground subway. This also shows the violation of the principle of humanity, and also it shows, well, as the Council of Europe Ministers Committee has indicated, that healthcare facilities have to enjoy the security. And this is a principle for all the European countries. Our country is trying to ensure the security of hospitals and clinics, but in the conditions of war, this is practically impossible. So the situation is deteriorating. And also, we have to pay attention to the pregnancy and childbirth. We have to pay attention to children and mothers. So we have very sad statistics for April. According to the Prosecutor's General Office, as of the morning of 17th of April, more than 1,400 children in Ukraine have suffered as a result of the military aggression. 470 children have died, and 948 have suffered from different kinds of injuries. So these data are not final, because the statistics does not include the medical workers that have been mobilized into the army and those who are dying. So as of today, we can see that aggressor is committing the crimes regarding the access to medical help of women and children, according to my research. I would like to tell you about my conclusions. Yes, there are violations of the principle of the medical neutrality, and this is a war crime. And Ukraine has a decree of the parliament on recognizing the jurisdiction of the ICC in relevant articles and in documenting the war crimes. So I would recommend to have separate article for medical crimes, because these values are very important, because it concerns the life and health of people, because, and according to our constitution, people, their health and their life are the highest value for the country. And this is in line, this is also in line with the article of military crimes and medical crimes. So today we are discussing the military medical law, and we need to register the facts of the crimes, and all those crimes have to find their response. And I believe that we need to discuss the question of medical neutrality in our country, because this concept is relevant both for the peaceful times and war crimes. It is relevant in order to protect healthcare workers, in order to provide as the relevant medical assistance to every person in need. Next point is that the military conflict in Ukraine shows that we need to improve the Geneva standards. Well, of course, we can analyze the Geneva Convention and make some conclusions for Ukraine, some consequences for Ukraine, but we need to have more clear-cut regulations, because right now we have differences. We have been having differences for many decades since 1848. And of course, right now people would like to have a just satisfaction, and this satisfaction has to be quick and efficient. And when we are talking about today we are talking about protecting the society, and we need to build the relevant mechanisms of response to the crimes committed by the aggression. And of course, we will have a lot of questions. We are going to address the European Court of Human Rights. The aggressor country has decided that after the 15th of March 2022, that they would not be fulfilling any decisions of the European Court after they have left the Council of Europe. And in any case, this timeliness has to be when we are trying to protect human rights. So we also have a decision, a resolution of case Moderator against Ukraine. The case was lasting for 23 years in the European Court of Human Rights. It lasted since 2007. So this long protection of human rights, such a long procedure, will it be able to protect human rights? So these gaps need us to find efficient mechanisms of response. When we're talking about the national mechanisms, starting from the Constitution, our laws and bylaws, they have some flaws, of course, but in any case, we have the main structure, the main mechanism, which is the Constitution of Ukraine, the principal legislation of the country. And our national law, our national legislation is trying to respond to the challenges of the times of war, including medical certificates, availability of family doctors, and possibilities to use paper prescriptions instead of digital ones. So it shows that the country is ready to adapt in order to ensure the constitutional rights of population to the healthcare. And it is important that in all decisions that are going to be made, we need to bear in mind the practice of the European Court of Human Rights and the European Convention of Children's Rights. So we need to remember that all the decisions have to take into account the best interests of people and especially of children. So people who is waging the war, for people, those army cannot be an enemy. And I'm sure that Ukraine is going to gain the victory over the enemy. I wish everybody peace and the soonest victory. Thank you, Irina. Thank you for paying attention to the main problems, including to the problems and challenges, and taking into account this possibility, well, our opportunities, the possibilities to provide healthcare has been deteriorated because of the large damages of the medical infrastructure, and because a lot of medical workers have suffered. And I agree that medical war crimes have to be separated into a relevant category that needs investigation and collecting the evidence. I would like to proceed to our next speaker. I would like to invite Ms. Kateryna Ulyrshova, a PhD assistant professor of the Department of the International and European Law of the Masaryk University, Czech Republic. Please.
Thank you very much. I know we are running a bit beyond the time, so I will just briefly perhaps say a few things which occurred to me while I was listening to other speakers, and then in other panels I'll be also happy, of course, if there is a chance. But so maybe what the last speaker, Irina, was also mentioning, the ICC and its role. So in this context, I was thinking that it was very challenging, of course, when it comes to investigation and prosecution of sexual and gender-based crimes, to effectively engage in these prosecutions also before the international criminal courts and tribunals, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it from others as well. But we also heard from Marta that when it comes to Tokyo or Nuremberg tribunals and situation after Second World War, at that time, those two first international tribunals were not at all or rarely targeting and investigating sexual and gender-based crimes, including also the situation clearly because of the victorious powers of the Soviet Union, rapes of, for example, on the territory of Germany, as was mentioned by the speakers. And then we had the ICTY and the Tribunal for Rwanda, which for the first time actually had a chance to articulate certain definitions in this respect. And then the ICC with its most complex now definitions in the Rome Statute, and with this policy on sexual and gender-based crimes as also articulated by the chief prosecutor back then, Fatou Bensouda. But despite that, even for the International Criminal Court, I think it is interesting to know that during the first decade of its functioning, of its mandate, the ICC actually failed to convict anyone at all at that time. For the first decade, I only now address, of rape or sexual slavery or other sexual crimes. And I think it is this is something which is prevalent throughout this and any actually conflict and situation which then has to be dealt with, because it seems that also judges at the ICC, some of them would have difficulties to accept that leaders and others can be convicted. I mean, they would not have difficulties to accept that leaders and others can be convicted of crimes such as killings or torture or pillage, even if they are far from the crime scene. But there was a great reluctance to hold individuals accountable for sex crimes unless they are the physical perpetrators, or they were present where the crimes were committed, or they can be linked to evidence encouraging the crimes. So you could see, like when you go through the case law of the ICC, that when it comes to physical perpetrators, this was a challenge when it comes to sexual and gender-based crimes, to actually convict those who were more far away from a scene, speaking of especially commanders, those who achieved orders. So in context of Ukraine, that would go, of course, for the Russian army officers, generals, or President Putin, and then others responsible. So I'm just mentioning this in this context. And in other words, it seems that sexual and gender-based crimes at that time called for a higher degree of scrutiny when compared with other charges. So in certain aspects, there was like a double standard when it comes to sexual and gender-based crimes also in this context. And in other words, this more so underlines the need of stronger focus on sexual and gender-based crimes in general. And I'm sure this will be very heavy task for Ukrainian now actors involved in this. So this is one aspect, and maybe also another aspect when Marta Havishko was mentioning, I think she can correct me if I got this wrong, but some of the relatives also talking about the humiliation of women publicly, etc. This was also, I think, again, this will be the role of watching, also including a legal community, about how the situation will be assessed by Ukrainian authorities in several contexts. Just to give an example, so I don't speak in abstract. For example, in the Bemba case at the International Criminal Court, the pretrial chamber then at the ICC rejected the possibility to qualify forcing women to address in public in order to humiliate them as other forms of sexual violence, as noted in the Rome Statute, by stating, I quote, "The facts submitted do not constitute forms of sexual violence of comparable gravity to the other crimes set forth in Article 7 of the Rome Statute," end of quote. So, and in contrast, when we compare, for example, Tribunal for Rwanda in the Akayesu case, which was the first judgment at the international level to define the crime of other forms of sexual violence, they including actually explicitly forced nudity. And the Tribunal for Rwanda made it clear that sexual violence is not, of course, limited, as we know, to physical invasion of the human body, and may include acts which do not involve penetration or even physical contact. So to put differently, similar elements of crimes, as Eugene, I think, was also discussing the elements of crimes and which categories, etc. The elements of crimes also, which had been successfully, for example, tried in one international tribunal, would not be accepted before the other in the similar contextual situation. So just to few more comments. Of course, in general, it seems that overturning the deeply embedded gender legacies of law, including of international law, was no easy task. But for example, for the ICC at its first decade, it was clear that very often there were ineffective prosecution, which would be affected by insufficient evidence or attribution of charges before trial, and in some cases also rather conservative judging, so to speak. And for example, the Women's Initiative for Gender Justice claimed that half of all individual charges for sexual and gender-based crimes have not survived the confirmation of charges hearing, which was a large number. So in other words, before international tribunals, now speaking namely about the ICC, often sexual gender-based crimes were never been laid, or despite extensive evidence of these crimes, or were poorly pleaded, or met with a higher degree of scrutiny than other charges, or failed to be also recognized by the bench, by the judges. So in this respect, of course, it will remain very challenging also for national courts, keeping in mind that it is very important to have the gender-sensitive investigations, and the issue of the collation of convincing evidence and targeted charges and bold judging and adequate financing, and all this is not a small task. So I think I will stop here, also given the time, but I just wanted to share some of those aspects from other angle. And thank you very much to all the previous speakers, and I look forward to hear our other speakers. Thank you.
Пані Катерино, щиро вам дякую за те, що звернули увагу і, власне, так природньо.
Ms. Katarzyna, thank you for paying attention to these issues and for proceeding to the questions of the next panel that we are going to have, for paying attention to the challenges during the investigation and bringing perpetrators to the responsibility in other conflicts in international courts and tribunals. It is important to mention that as you have said, that these crimes are not going to be considered only by the ICC and other possible tribunals, but this will be our national courts that are going to bring perpetrators to responsibility, and they are going to make decisions whether they are going to make decisions about the elements of crimes, and it requires concerted work of the national law enforcement agencies, of the national prosecution, and the national judiciary system, which has to be gender sensitive and understand the challenges in the identification of crimes. And also, this is a question of making changes into the Ukrainian legislation. Because if we say that CRSV is a crime that is never too late, but in our national jurisdiction, we have limited time frames of investigation, and maybe we need to make changes in the legislation regarding this question. So I would like to invite the person who is working with these categories of cases and representing the system. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Irina Didenko, head of the Department of Procedural Management of Pretrial Investigations and Public Prosecutions in Criminal Proceedings on Crimes related to Sexual Violence in the Department of Combating Crimes Committed in the Conditions of Armed Conflict of the Prosecutor General's Office. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm happy to welcome you. Greetings. I would like to note your enormous efforts and your work of those people who were working on these materials that we are discussing right now. This is a very good work, very good research, and in the introductory remarks, we have remarks from the Prosecutor General. So the Prosecutor General has totally reviewed this research, and according to him, it is important that all the prosecutors should use your research, your work in their activities. What brought my attention? This was the first question of the history, the question from the history of Russian war against Ukraine, the history that is repeating. And we understand that this violations, this raping has been continuing not for several years, but for decades and centuries. And we need to remember about that. As for the work of the prosecutor's office, I will tell you about our situation right now. Right now, we can say about 175 registered cases, or even a bit more, because yesterday and today we are continuing our work with the survivors, and this number is going to grow. But it doesn't reveal the entire scale of crimes, because these are only those people who are ready to testify. Among them, we have 40 men, others are women. We have 13 children, 12 girls and 1 boy. But this boy used to live for 4 months, forced to watch as his mother was raped. So we have more and more people who are referring to us because we have started to work with psychologists who are providing medical assistance and psychological assistance to the survivors. So we are asking the psychologists, professionals, because they are not allowed to disclose the medical secrets, but we are asking the psychologists to tell people about our services, that we have good coordination with different civil society organizations, and we are able to provide medical assistance, targeted assistance, including legal assistance. So psychologists are sharing this information, and people who trust the doctors, they are starting to come forward and to tell about the violence and tortures that they have survived. I'm not sure if you saw yesterday, one of our survivors was giving testimony in the US Congress, and she told what was happening to her in January of this year, so not so long ago. So as long as we have occupation, we will have violence. So she has the right to move to the United States. Her daughter is a citizen of the United States, so she thanked to the United States people for this, but she dreams of returning to their homeland and rebuilding her house. So probably this is a dream of every Ukrainian. As for the results of our investigations, right now we have 16 Russian military as suspects in absentia. 5 accusations have been transferred to court, and we have 1 court resolution. Also, we have a lot of plans thanks to the work of our interagency working group, which is chaired by Ms. Christina Kit. We have the key guidelines. The work of our subgroup continues. We are going to continue our meetings to develop the new documents, because in fact, we still have a lot of work in front of us. So maybe this week or the next week, we are going to finalize the draft of our action plan about our strategic approaches, which is covering a lot of spheres of life. We are trying to join the efforts of all the stakeholders, and everybody is willing to do this. So we are offering a strategic event on the 5th of May, where we would like to hear the opinions and use the best solutions that will allow us to simultaneously restore the justice by bringing perpetrators to responsibility and to redress the rights of the survivors right now. As Ms. Christina has mentioned, reparations don't always mean money. We need to continuously support the survivors, as it was mentioned, and for life. So this was a brief remark from me. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you, Ms. Irina, for being able to participate. Thank you for the work of the Prosecutor General's office and for the changes that can be seen by the expert community and the legal community. Thank you for this possibility to have joint work for the sake of people in need, for the sake of protection of people. So even those who have not suffered, they need to know that they may be protected in the future. And this is our common work to prevent, to help, and to save people. Right now, I would like to return to the nature of sexual crimes during the conflict. So I would like to invite Mr. Artem Krikontrush, a lawyer engaged in legal counseling of sexual violence of victims of JurFem support and head of the white-collar crime practice at PwC Legal. Unfortunately, we have no sound. As far as we understand, Mr. Artem can reconnect. So not to lose the time, I'm going to give the floor to Ms. Marta Zmysla, the coordinator of the legal aid hotline called JurFem Support. So she works directly with the survivors who are referring to the hotline and informing about the cases of violence. So what particular help can be provided in the conditions of war, and what is the situation of referrals. So Ms. Irina has mentioned that today we have officially registered more than 100 criminal offenses, but this number does not depict the real number of cases. And taking into account the experience, we understand why this is happening and why we need to provide the sufficient time to the survivors so that they would feel that they can apply for justice. Marta, please. Thank you, Kateryna. Greetings, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank you for the research, for providing the legal assessment through the gender lens, for the offered ways to protect survivors, and thank you for this opportunity to share the experience of helping to the survivors of the military conflict. In April 2022, we have created our organization, JurFem Support. This is a hotline that provides a free of charge legal aid and psychological aid to the survivors of sexual violence, including the CRSV. We have more than 30 lawyers. They work with us. They get engaged into the legal aid to the survivors. Our lawyers can be located in different parts of Ukraine, and according to the location of the survivor, we can ensure a full legal support of their case, starting from the legal consultations up to preparing relevant applications and petitions and representation of the interests of survivors at all the cases, at all the stages of a case. We have a hotline number, and every day we are receiving the calls from people. So for the year, we have received more than 400 applications. We have mostly about sexual violence, and right now we are supporting certain cases of conflict-related sexual violence. As for the challenges that we have during the work with the cases and in the investigation of such crimes. So the first point that I would like to pay attention to is that unfortunately the legal community doesn't have so many lawyers who are ready to work with these kinds of cases. Even those lawyers who are ready to work, they don't always have professional competences to work with the survivors. So, as an organization, we are conducting active trainings for our lawyers. We have the Academy of Human Rights Protection, and we have courses for gender-sensitive communications, for better understanding the nature of the violence and its consequences, and we have several modules on CRSV as a war crime. Also, we have continuous internal trainings on relevant topics, including sexual violence. The second challenge that we have is that the survivors of sexual violence, they are taking care about their own security. They don't want their personal data to be published in the open access. So confidentiality is one of our priorities, as some of our colleagues have already mentioned. So these are some of the challenges that prevent survivors to ask for help, because they are afraid for they are concerned with their own security. And the cases, the registered cases of CRSV, they don't depict the real scale of the problem, taking into account different numerous factors. So I believe that in the future, we are going to have a lot of new cases that we will be able to identify. And another thing is that the survivors who decided to address the law enforcement agency don't always explain to them their rights to legal assistance and why they need it. So if a survivor, a lot of survivors believe that they need only to make a statement to the law enforcement without any further support. But we have to understand that later the survivor may need to prepare a civil petition. Sometimes they need to provide the relevant evidence to substantiate the damage. Also, they need to ensure their confidentiality at all stages of a criminal case. And also sometimes they need to have their interests represented in court. Sometimes they need help to resolve some other associated questions, like establishing different facts that are relevant to a court case. Sometimes they need to restore the lost documents. So we need to inform the survivors about all of their rights to use legal assistance. And we, as an organization, we are ready to do it, and we are providing this help. Another challenge is that as experts who provide the help, they need to be able to identify relevant forms of CRSV. This is not only rape, but this can be force into prostitution, forcing to observe sexual violence, and other forms, as we have been mentioning today. So the professionals who provide help, this can be humanitarian workers, social workers, and others. They need to understand different forms of crimes. They need to be able to identify the crimes. They need to be able to put correct questions, to refer a survivor according to their needs to the relevant service providers. If we look at the global experience, at the experience of countries who have survived military conflicts, we can see that the survivors sometimes got reparations in 10 or 15 years after the end of the conflict. We have examples from Colombia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so on. But in Ukraine, we have thousands of criminal cases. We have dozens of criminal cases about the CRSV, and we need to find the mechanisms and tools to support the survivors right now, not to delay the process for many years. So right now, a lot of comprehensive reparation programs have been created, and we need to ensure their accessibility. And restoring the justice is a task not only for Ukraine, but also for international community as well. It is important right now to develop the mechanisms and tools for payments to the survivors. When we are talking about reparations, it cannot always be measured in terms of money. The context is much bigger. This is financial support in finding work and rehabilitation and medical services that need to be provided to the survivors. So right now it is important to ensure comprehensive support to the survivor and not to postpone the process for many years. As a conclusion, I have to say that, of course, we have to investigate every case of sexual violence, but we need to do it in a correct way, and we need to provide as much support to the survivors as possible. As an organization, we are actively working to do this. We are trying to ensure comprehensive support to the survivors in the legal and psychological context. Thank you. Thank you, Marta, first of all, for your work, and thanks for the work of your Department of Legal Support. And thank you for focusing on different forms of sexual violence, on different possible forms. We have mentioned when people were forced to watch sexual violence and other things. So the law enforcement officers have to understand this. They need to be able to identify or to help the survivors to identify the type of the crime and be able to go to the law enforcement. That's why we need to have an awareness-raising campaign about what is happening and why these things are considered the violation of human rights. So this is a very big need for today. We need to have the survivor-centered approach, and all the services have to be able to quickly respond in order to ensure all the needs and to help the survivor cope with their experiences to the survivors and their families. And now I suggest to give the floor to Mr. Artem. So this time we can hear you. So Mr. Artem Krekontrush, the co-author of the report, lawyer engaged in legal counseling at the JurFem support. Please. From the things that I see right now, unfortunately, In the legal community, for example, among the non-specialized lawyers, when I see what other lawyers do who coincidentally have to deal with the cases of sexual violence in the conflict, and people who are working close to the legal community, they don't always understand that the conflict-related sexual violence and the sexual violence as a general crime there is a big difference between these two notions. And because of that, we have a lot of myths and misunderstandings about the length, for example, the time frames. No, we don't have time limitations. When we are looking at the sexual violence as a war crimes, it has no limitation of time and evidence base. Sometimes I saw the cases when the survivors moved to other regions. They were asking for help from the local lawyers, and those lawyers have no experience with war crimes. So the local lawyers are starting to tell them that there are no prospects, there have been no medical examination, there is no sufficient testimonies, but objectively the situation is different. For example, the ICC in their standards, they say that these crimes have a minimal standard of support of evidence. And in the international practice, there are cases when people were convicted for sexual crimes according to the testimony of a survivor or of witnesses. And objectively, during these investigative activities like medical examination in the war, it is impossible to do it in the conditions of war, because very often cases of sexual violence during the conflict, they happen in the times of occupation of settlements. Sometimes the occupation can last for months or two. Some territories are still occupied in our country, so we can't talk about opportunities to have a full-fledged investigation with all the medical examinations. It is impossible to do this, and it is not necessary. So I believe that one of the main tasks of the organization and of the entire legal community is that we have to debunk those myths and misunderstandings. We need to explain the difference between the sexual violence during the conflict. We need to explain the specific traits. The survivors need to understand that any time can pass, as soon as they have the will, as soon as they would want to go to the law enforcement, to a lawyer, as soon as they would like to do it, the lawyers of JurFem will be ready to help them. That is why I'm sure that the small number of applications that we have after the sexual violence committed by the Russian military, we have such a small number because the survivors are suffering the trauma, they are suffering from stress. Sometimes they need years and months to work with psychologists. And I'm sure that after some time, when people get enough psychological help, they will be able to start speaking. And people need to understand that it is never too late. They can do it in 1 year or 2 years. So if they want to do it, if they are ready, they can always start speaking. And it is very important to strengthen the public communications around this topic. We need to debunk those myths. We need to demonstrate the standards and cases in the international judiciary practice. And we need to explain to them that we are waiting for them, whatever time it takes. Those people who are strong enough to start working even now, to start going to the law enforcement, I can see that very often, I can see that people start to do something, but after some time they stop. They are not working proactively. They are not going to the lawyer in 90% of cases. And we as lawyers, we should not be pushing on people. because this is their choice, this is their right and their life. It doesn't depend on us, it depends only on survivors, whether they want to do it. So we need to help people to stay confident that they can do it at any time. So we need to show again and again the specific traits of these crimes, the low standards of evidence, and the absence of time limitations, that this is never too late to do this. I'm happy to see that people are calling to the hotline. I'm very happy to see that people don't feel shame, that the survivors don't feel that they are guilty of these war crimes. I wish that every survivor would be able to find the justice within the national courts, Ukrainian courts, who are authorized to consider cases of sexual crimes, and on the global level, in the International Criminal Court, or in a special tribunal that may be created as a result of this war. I would like to repeat once again to everybody who is listening to us, if you know about such cases, if you are a survivors, if your friends or family members are survivors, please remember that it's never too late to ask for justice. JurFem has expertise and possibilities. We can limit your participation, we can limit your exposure to avoid re-traumatization. People are willing to help you. We have all the necessary preconditions to help. As soon as you are ready, we are also ready to help you. Artem, thank you for your report and thank you for your help. I would like to emphasize, so when you say that it depends on the survivor to start a criminal proceeding, we are talking about their choice, but we are not pushing the responsibilities on their shoulders as well. The law enforcement have to understand that during investigation, the collection of evidence relies upon the law enforcement. So the people who are working in the pre-trial investigations, authorities, and we are relying on those people, and they have to improve their practice, to improve their knowledge and skills, to be able to quickly collect the evidence and protect the rights, the violated rights of the people. Right, Artem? Yes, I just wanted to add, yes, for people who don't have a high level of legal education, we need to understand the difference between the sexual violence as a war crime and Article 438 of the Criminal Code. Yes, this is correct. To start the investigation, to start a proceeding, it is not important whether they have an application from the survivor. If the law enforcement agency gets the information about a case from witnesses from different sources, they are obligated to register the crime in the register, in the unified register, and they have to conduct an investigation irrespectively of the fact whether the survivor will be actively participating, whether the survivor will be willing to provide evidence and testimony. Thank you. Now, let us look at this issue from the international perspective. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Caroline Edgerton, a Canadian lawyer with 3 decades of experience in national and international criminal investigations. She has worked for a long time at the United Nations as a legal specialist and trial attorney in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And she is actively participating in the legislative reform efforts and improving the practices of investigating the crimes of CRSV. Please, Ms. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kateryna, and thank you to and congratulations to JurFem and all my colleagues and contributors to this really excellent report. I've enjoyed listening to also my fellow experts this morning. And I just wanted to start my remarks by referring to a couple of points which I found particularly interesting from my colleagues. Kateryna Ulirova, for example, spoke about the gravity requirement when we're dealing with sexual violence as a war crime. And I note that this gravity requirement isn't contained in the Geneva Conventions, customary international law, the statutes of the ad hoc tribunals, or the legislation of some European states, including Ukraine. So when we engage in the debate about the ratification or the adoption of the Rome Statute, I find it interesting that this gravity element would be required under the Rome Statute, but would not need to be established to prove the war crime of sexual violence under the Criminal Code of Ukraine. And Marta made the very important point, underscored the importance of recognizing different forms of sexual violence. This requires investigators, I would say, to start with the determination of whether an act is sexual in nature. And that requires assessing whether an act is sexual in nature will require actors to take steps to understand the context within which the act occurred. And I'm going to come back to context because that's actually at the core of my remarks. I wanted to talk about a little bit about challenges, but a little bit more about the way forward, sort of moving past those challenges to build better cases, to so that actors might be better equipped to deal with some of those challenges. And because this conference is about gender, I wanted to say a couple of words about what having a gender perspective practically means when you're dealing with survivors of sexual violence. For those of you who don't know, and this is my opinion based on the experience, it means taking an individualized approach to any survivor you might be dealing with, and understanding their different intersecting identities, because that's going to affect their needs and also their experiences of the justice system. And a gendered perspective really requires an understanding of the impact of gender on the crimes, the causes of the crimes, the nature of the violations, how they're experienced, and the specific measures required for protection. But what people I see don't tend to recognize is how a gendered perspective will really impact on your methodology. It's going to impact on the words you use in dealing with survivors. And sometimes it will even help you understand the perpetrator's motivation for the crime. I'm going to come back to gendered perspective after I go through the next topic, which is about CRSV never happens in isolation, and you've heard some of the experts today refer to that. Acts of conflict-related sexual violence never happen in isolation of anything else. And so, and I think this is really, again, it's core to building better cases. Any account that investigators, prosecutors, or civil society actors might record will never, because CRSV never happens in isolation, will never only be about the rape or the torture or the humiliation or the forced nudity or the invasive security search. It will never be about that. There will always be another broader story, and it's going to be a story about the context. And building cases with a focus that's too narrow, that's just focused in a linear way on the sexual violence itself, really risks having those crimes misclassified as something opportunistic rather than part of a broader pattern of criminality. So I think it's very important to understand that too narrow focus on the CRSV can disconnect the experiences of the victims from the other events that might be happening at the same time. It can minimize the harms that are suffered, and it also obscures the evidence that could be relevant to other international crimes, as well as patterns of crime and linkage that could be attributed to mid-level and high-level perpetrators. Ultimately, I think we all know that very few incidents of CRSV are opportunistic incidents. And a contextual approach to investigating and prosecuting CRSV is going to ensure it's really situated within the broader pattern of crimes in Ukraine. It's going to ensure that CRSV is really embedded in the fabric of the conflict in a way that reflects reality. And that brings me to another point that I wanted to talk about, which are red flags. These are situations, when we're talking about the context, these are situations which have been recognized as indicators of the possibility that CRSV might have occurred. And I'm going to give you some examples. Disappearance. People who are evacuating, being evacuated, or fleeing violence. House raids or house searches. Isolation. Detention. Whether that's at camps, whether it's at checkpoints, whether it's infiltration, movement of troops, incursions into villages by individuals or groups of soldiers and armed men, looting and pillaging. So when you're thinking about the context and coming back to the gendered perspective, I'd like to ask those of you participating in the conference today to think with a gender perspective about some of the questions you might ask yourself about a case of pillaging or house searches, because these are red flags for sexual violence. With a gender perspective, how might you evaluate or assess the situation of a survivor? Might she be an easy target? And I'm going to, keeping in mind time, I'm going to just make one more point that I think is useful for us all to keep in mind. It's that rape and other forms of sexual violence do not need to be officially sanctioned to be considered a war crime. You don't need an order. You don't need to look for an order. Only one single incident of sexual violence can constitute a war crime. Any other idea really gives rise to false assumptions about the causes of conflict rape. And I personally think this kind of narrow thinking about needing an order can marginalize other forms of sexual violence and marginalize other victims of sexual violence, male, LGBTQI, children born of rape, for example. Sometimes wartime rape is a weapon of war. This is true. Some commanders will use rape or the threat of rape or other forms of sexual violence strategically to punish enemies or enemy communities. But remember, rape has multiple causes. And in the majority of cases, I tend to think it has more to do with internal practices and discipline of fighting forces or the strength of the military hierarchy than with strategic imperatives. So don't distract yourselves from what might be a solid, comprehensive investigation by getting caught up in this idea that you need to look for an order. We need to go beyond this and beyond weapon of war narratives so that we can keep CRSV situated within the fabric of the conflict. All right, so I'm keeping an eye on the time, and that takes me right to the boundary of my time. I'd be very happy to take on board any questions from anybody at all. Thank you.
Пані Каролайн, дуже вам дякуємо за ваш виступ і за те, що ви
Thanks a lot, Ms. Caroline, for your report. Thank you for focusing on these concerning aspects and challenges. As for the recommendations that you mentioned, yes, when we are talking about war crimes, we are not limiting ourselves to this CRSV. So we have started to develop this problem in our research, but we understand that this topic requires some efforts. We need to identify gender aspects. We need to develop the methodology. And I'm inviting everybody to participate in this work. If you have any questions, well, we don't have questions right now, but we can return to them later if we have. Right now, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Kateryna Busol, who has joined us, so she can continue on the topic that we have started. So, Ms. Kateryna Busol, lawyer, senior lecturer of the Faculty of Law of the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Thank you, Ms. Kateryna. Greetings, dear colleagues. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to participate, and I'm very grateful for your holistic and comprehensive support, comprehensive approach when you are looking at the crimes. I was asked to look at the topic of reparation, not only as a system or absence of the system, and how I'm going to also speak about how the survivors are signaling their needs, what preferences the survivors have regarding the reparations. I would like to make brief remarks in the next 10 minutes. We need to say that Ukraine is representing a very big know-how because it has activated a discussion of the interim justice system, which ensures a comprehensive response to the war crimes, to the aggression, not only using criminal legislation, but also Ukraine has initiatives on establishing the truth. Ukraine has initiatives for reparations. I mean targeted support to the survivors of the most grave crimes and grave violations of rights of their families. And also we are developing the policies that would prevent this happening in the future. So we are continuing the judiciary reform, the anti-corruption reform. So we are making changes that would make it impossible repetition of those crimes in the future. And in order to establish the quick and relevant and meaningful help in the future to the survivors. Together with Colombia, Ukraine was one of the first states that during the military activities, we have been discussing this comprehensive policy of interim justice. And we have been discussing the questions of reparations, but as far as we know, this comprehensive policy has not been implemented yet. And objectively, its implementation was difficult because of the full-scale invasion. So where does this bring us now at this point of time? As we can see, in Ukraine, we had two important initiatives about reparations before the full-scale invasion. After the full-scale invasion, we had a program of 100,000. So this was about people who were imprisoned because of their active because of their active position. So the leading human rights organizations were working with them. They were providing psychological help to the survivors of the war. And the survivors were entitled to have a one-time compensation in the amount of 100,000 hryvnias. But this was an initial step. This amount is insufficient even for the basic treatment. A lot of survivors were telling about big problems with dentistry service, with prothesizing, and of course, this amount was not sufficient. So this approach was focused on the survivors, but did not take into account the needs of the families. Also, there is a program of Mr. Levko Lukyanenko, which is aimed to help the survivors of crimes of the Russian Federation because of their support of Ukraine. But these two programs and further discussions of the reparation programs, they did not have any gender lens. They didn't take into account the difference in victimizations of men, women, non-binary people, boys and girls. So before the full-scale invasion, the Venice Commission, which was reviewing the legislative initiatives, the legislative drafts of interim justice and reparations, and UN agencies were saying that Ukraine did not sufficiently involve the survivors into the development of the draft documents. So the gender lens can be very different. It has to take into account not only the sex of a person, and it has to take into account the intersectionality. For example, how the victimization is connected with the age of the survivor, with the place of their residence, and with the biases of local communities. So this lack of considerations led to the fact that the government policies were not very survivor-centered, in spite of the best intentions that they had. So what happened after the full-scale invasion? After that, after the full-scale invasion, the component of criminal prosecution has grown, and also consideration of the case and the accusation of a perpetrator is one of the form of reparations. So we can see a better prioritizing of this form of reparation in Ukraine and in other countries. Other forms of reparations, such as satisfaction, restitution, and guarantee of non-repetition, they are still underdeveloped. The situation is gradually changing, and before the full-scale invasion, together with the civil society organization, the Bluebird, which is providing constantly the psychological help to the survivors, together with Truth Hounds, human rights organization, who are documenting the crimes, and with the Global Survivors Fund, the research was conducted regarding the needs of the survivors, including survivors of sexual violence, and it researched their needs. It showed not only the needs of those people, but it also underlined the gender aspect of those needs among the stigmatized category of people. I was not able to participate in the discussions from the beginning, but I'm sure that you have raised the question that among the 70,000 of criminal cases that have been registered after the start of aggression, we have less than 200 cases about CRSV. This tells us that there is a stigma, and it tells us that we don't know enough the needs of the survivors. So the research conducted by our 3 partners of human rights organizations partners, it shows that CRSV survivors pay a lot of attention to the investigations and court cases. So this is one of the form of their satisfaction and the form of punishment. It shows the person who committed the crimes, it demonstrates the motives, and it shows that a lot of crimes have been committed as a result of pro-Ukrainian position of the survivors. But also, this is a signpost of how Ukraine can move forward. The survivors paid a lot of attention to consistent, to sustainable medical and psychological help. So whatever one-time payment you have for a medical examination, this money is not enough, because after living on the occupied territories, after being in a prison, in the hands of the aggressors. They need a long-term rehabilitation. Also, a lot of women have mentioned, a lot of CRSV have mentioned that they need couple counseling. So it is necessary to provide psychological help, not only to the person, but to the couple. It is very difficult to restore relations in a couple after the CRSV. So this is what differs CRSV from other international crimes. Also, what is very important before the full-scale invasion, and it is still more important right now, that reparations has to be not only for the survivors of violence, but also they have to be provided to the family members and to children. Because the trauma when you don't know where your loved people are, it is traumatizing people, it is traumatizing relatives very much. I'm not talking about the stigma of a person who have survived sexual violence or who have been held prisoner in camps. So these things were appearing before this full-scale invasion, but right now they are even more evident. And in the end, I can say that we can see a positive change in direction, not only in the work of human rights organizations in Ukraine who have been lobbying for a more holistic, comprehensive and gender-sensitive approach in helping the survivors, and also international partners of Ukraine are starting to remind to the Ukrainian government that a criminal prosecution is an important component, but this component should not be alone. I would like to point your attention to the important document. This is a report of the Investigative Commission of the UN, which was publicized in the middle of March of this year. So items 104, 105, it has recommendations to the government of Ukraine saying that some initiatives can be implemented right now. The first initiative is making a register of survivors. In order to do this, we need to establish the criteria of selection, we need to classify the survivors, and this methodology has to be gender sensitive. We need to look at the multiple discrimination. We need to look on how different aspects of different or potential discrimination influence the victimization of a person. And the second and third point, as I have mentioned, the Investigative Commission recommended that Ukraine should ensure urgent medical and psychological help to the survivors. They have been talking not only with the Ukrainian government, but also with the human rights organizations and with the survivors around Ukraine. And these three conclusions are very important, and this is a good signal to the Ukrainian government and to us as a professional human rights community, is that we need to continue the track of criminal responsibility of Russian high-rank officials and perpetrators on the ground. But at the same time, we need to simultaneously go back to the idea of justice, of ensuring holistic and comprehensive support to our survivors. Thank you for the attention. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them. Ms. Kateryna, thanks a lot for the report and for providing this broad framework for discussing today and tomorrow. So yes, this is a good document to review, and also you can read the research text, you can read different publications and the work of Ms. Kateryna regarding the reparations. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. Please read the presentations and the materials. And now I'm going to draw some conclusions, taking into account the fact that we are short of time. So today we have been working on the topics on typical violations of law and customs of war committed by the Russian Federation on the territory of Ukraine. We have been discussing sexual violence during the conflict and also challenges in the identification and investigation of these types of crimes. Also, we were discussing the possibilities of a redressal of damages and possibilities for redressal with a survivor-centered approach. So far, we don't have questions in the chat, so probably we are going to finish our discussion for today. Tomorrow, we are going to have discussions about reparations and sexual violence and so on. And we have, tomorrow we will have time for discussions. I would like to invite everybody to join us tomorrow. So tomorrow we are going to discuss deportation, displacement, and kidnapping of children, and ways of ensuring real justice as the way to prevent the war crimes in the future. And the question, will the justice be achieved? So I'm inviting everybody to participate tomorrow. And I would like to remind you that this conference and this research that you can see in the chat, you can see the link in the chat. And this was made possible thanks to the people of the United States, with the help of the United States of the International Development Agency, under the Justice for All activity. The results of the conference constitute the conclusions, and the research do not necessarily reflect the views of the United States Agency for International Development and the United States government. Thanks to everybody who participated in the research, and thanks to all those people who participated in the event. Thanks to everybody, and see you tomorrow. Thank you, and stay safe.